There's some kind of problem with it. What is this?
Let me give a quick little review on what my experience has been with Sway and Wayland since I moved over from i3. I was getting a lot of flack for still using i3, and I figured maybe there was something that I was missing by still relying on the same thing that I've been using since 2021. So I decided that it was maybe time to try something new, and I went with Sway mostly because it's supposed to be very backwards compatible with i3. You're supposed to be able to reuse a lot of your i3 config with Sway without any issues. However, I have some complaints, and I think some of them have to do with Wayland, some of them are more Sway specific. By default, a lot of applications still need to connect to an X server in some way or another to be able to open. So when I was launching Sway from a TTY console login, meaning I was using like the command line login instead of the typical graphical login, which I never had to do when I was using i3, by the way. I had been using i3 both on Ubuntu and Pop! OS, and I never had to configure anything extra with my login manager to be able to detect that i3 was installed on the system and for me to have that as a choice for login. However, I've had to manually configure a login manager to detect Sway on the system and to run Sway when I log in, which has been a bit of a pain. And the reason I had to do that was because it still needed to connect to an X server to run, because a lot of the applications that I wanted to run still needed to connect to an X server, which means that I couldn't just run Wayland. It has to use X Wayland, which is an X server that runs on top of the Wayland compositor. I found it a lot more tedious to configure than i3. i3 was very much like, it worked quite well out of the box, and I never had any issues with stability or compatibility with different applications. I also had to move Polybar over to Waybar, which was kind of annoying because it was a completely different way of configuring everything. I've also found it a lot more difficult to manage windows across multiple monitors. I had a multi-monitor setup before. I've mostly been doing development on a single monitor setup for a while. However, now I've changed my setup again so that I am doing dual monitor, and there's no built-in mirroring. In Wayland, you have to use Wayland Mirror, and sometimes I find it can kind of bug out. It turns recursive and it does some crazy things. So I'm not a huge fan of the fact that I have to use an external library and it's not built into Wayland by default, the ability to mirror your display. Yeah, I've just found in general, the process for configuring Sway has been a lot more tedious. There's also the fact that there is Sway, and then there's also Sway FX, which I am using Sway FX, but there just seems to be a lot of layers to it that add complexity, and sure, it adds an ability to like customize. However, I don't think that it's adding enough value for me. I feel like it should just work out of the box and then still have the option to customize further like i3. Anyway, it's been a little bit frustrating. Another thing that I've found that's really fun is that whenever I sign in and I launch Sway, unless I am launching Sway with a DBus run session, my Waybar doesn't load. And I'm still figuring this one out. Maybe by the time I've published this video, I'll have figured it out. But that is another incredibly frustrating thing, because now that I've configured my login manager to launch Sway on startup, now it's my Waybar is just never loading. If and when I was doing the console login, I was able to run it with DBus run session and my Waybar would load correctly, but then a bunch of different applications wouldn't run properly because then I didn't have X Wayland, the X server wasn't running. So I think that could have to do with either I need to change something in my Sway config to get the X server up and running if it's not already doing that by default. Again, these are so many things that are just basic that I never had to touch in i3. Also, the fact that Wayland has its own clipboard situation, like you have Wayland copy, Wayland paste. It's not very annoying. It was just like a slight annoyance because it means that I've had to change my Emacs setup to be able to use my clipboard on Wayland. Before, I was able to just use Xclip and then I would just use PB copy on Mac and it was great. So I just don't like the fact that I'm now having to jump to a different clipboard manager as well. It seems like one of those things where so far my experience has just been, it's like a can of worms. It's you tweak a few things and then it works well enough, but then one thing doesn't work. And then so you have to fix that one thing that doesn't work. And then you find out that something else isn't quite working how you'd expect. And it's just felt like this kind of nonstop cycle of things not quite working as expected and having to go in and change things. So I would say it has not been a super smooth onboarding experience for me, and I miss i3. I really don't like how they're managing displays, and I don't know too much of like how they've implemented it or the technicality of why things operate the way they do in Wayland, and maybe I should dive into that a little bit more. But I just found X11 i3 was very easy. It just worked, and I didn't really have to configure much. I was able to live stream from i3 for years and never ran into any issues. Okay, I had audio desync all the time. Relatively minor and expected on a Linux system. However, I don't even think Wayland is compatible with OBS. There's just been a lot of frustration. If you can't tell, I'm kind of venting a little bit in this video. I would love to hear your experiences as well, and let me know what you think in the comments. Bye for now.